Hello, and welcome to The Enterprising Investor, the flagship investor podcast for CFA Institute. I'm Raymond Pang, Senior Researcher at CFA Institute, and I'm thrilled to have Greg Fisher on the show today. Greg holds a PhD, is a CFA charter holder, and is a Fellow of the Royal Society of Arts. He is a researcher and practitioner whose career spans central banking, asset management, think tanks, and academia. Greg's research sits at the intersection of complexity science, economics, and finance, whereas research is practitioner-grounded and directly relevant for the asset management industry. He began his career at the Bank of England, where he worked on monetary policy, financial stability, and asset allocation, before moving into the world of global macro strategy and investment management. Later, he led a policy think tank and gave speeches at the OECD and the UK Parliament on applying complexity thinking to economic and financial systems. Today, Greg is a research fellow at the Institute of Economics at the Santana Institute for Advanced Studies in Pisa, where he continues to bridge research and practice. His recent paper, Complexity Arbitrage, brings together different areas of research in complexity science into how emergent behavior, narratives, and systemic dynamics shape asset prices. In this wide-ranging conversation, we'll explore what complexity means for uncertainty versus risk, implications for financial modeling, and applications for systems-level investing, and how practitioners in the asset management industry can use such areas in their workflows and decision-making. Welcome to the show, Greg.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here. I think the CFA Institute holds a really important role in the financial sector, so I'm honoured to be here.
Oh, great. Let's jump in. So maybe we can start the conversation by really giving the context of our discussion, as we may have those in the audience who may not be aware of this topic, or those who are aware, but only of one area of complexity, and less so of the broader field. So from your perspective, what does complexity and systems thinking mean for financial markets, particularly for the asset management industry?
Okay, that's a big question. It'll take a while to unpack that question, actually, or rather unpack my answer to that question. But let me start with pointing out that the word complexity is really terrible. And I really wish we could go back in time and sort of stop using it and just, nip it in the bud. But unfortunately, it's been locked in and we're stuck with it. For listeners who are not familiar with complexity science, for now can maybe simply replace the word complexity with systems, because really fundamentally complexity science is about the study of systems and the sort of parts of systems and how they interact. So complexity, horrible word, just think systems for now. And in a few minutes, I'll come on and try and unpack what I mean, how I define complex systems. So to answer your question, what I think I would do. So one of the principles of complexity science is that context matters, right? And I know that that's understood outside complexity science as well, but but context does matter. And so what I want to do is put complexity science into its historical context. And so if you just let me do that for a little while, I need to kind of go back to the Enlightenment, and then once I've done that, I will try to define what I mean by complexity science, and then address the question you've asked, which is about the relevance for asset management. Okay, so the historical context, we have to. I'm going to try and do this fairly quickly, and I'm going to use very broad brushstrokes. We have to go back to the Enlightenment, 200 to 300 years ago, where a particular way of thinking emerged, and that had two main features. One came from Isaac Newton and mechanics, so Newtonian mechanics, and that treats the universe as like a clockwork machine, and we're quite familiar with that. And it's based on cause and effect. So that's something we're very familiar with. But the second issue or theme within this mindset really comes from the spontaneous order literature, and we're used to thinking of this in economics in terms of systems gravitating to equilibrium. But there's actually a broader literature and a sort of broader sort of body of thinking, which is specifically about spontaneous order. And Friedrich Hayek was one of the most vocal proponents of this in the 20th century. But this does go back to the likes of Adam Ferguson and Adam Smith in the Enlightenment. And the broad idea is that social systems gravitate to a state of order that is beneficial to the parts of that system. And obviously this links with the idea of self-organization. So those two principles, and we can go into that into much more detail. I actually gave a speech at the London Interdisciplinary School a couple of weeks ago. So I've done a lot of thinking about this recently, and that talk was about this exact subject. We can go into that in more detail if you like a bit later. But so this is what I'm calling the mechanistic mindset. And so it's these two principles of mechanics or cause and effect plus spontaneous order or self-organization. And I think a really good illustration of how the world is complex and doesn't quite work like a machine, but we tend to treat it as a machine is COVID-19. So this, the world is interconnected and dynamic, and this COVID-19 spread across the world very quickly and took a lot of governments by surprise. Largely, I think, because a lot of public policies kind of built on this mechanistic mindset or assumptions, and so we're kind of unprepared for these network type effects. So lots of governments were caught, and then having to make a policy mostly on the fly.
Yes.
Okay. And a lot of those policies ended up being quite poor. But anyway, I think COVID-19 is a good example of how we tend to frame the world and how the world actually is, and can catch us out. So complexity science in this context can be seen as a reaction to the insufficiency of that mindset that emerged from the Enlightenment to the mechanistic mindset. So there are something like 5 ancestral subjects from which complexity science is sort of emerged. And these ancestral subjects are, I'll list them. They are general systems theory, dynamical systems theory, cybernetics, complex systems theory, and AI/information theory. And if people want a really good visual on this, Brian Castellani and Lascaris have done a really good map of this, and it's called the Map of the Complexity Sciences 2021. And your listeners can look that up if they have access to the internet now, just to give a sense of these ancestral subjects. And so this is now a huge subject. Okay, it goes back decades, and lots of very clever people and lots of people have contributed to it, and now it's very large. So what I'll do is I think I'll pause there and just ask if that's clear so far, and then I will go on to my definition of complexity science.
Yeah, no, absolutely, absolutely. And I think just hearing the different areas which complexity touches, physics, biology, economics, psychology, there's so many areas which, complexity resides. And, of course, while our podcast will be mainly focused on, on finance, particularly, asset management, it's really, I think, quite useful to keep that sort of broader picture in mind. And also just the history as well of complexity. You mentioned some of the sort of the earlier areas, general systems theory, dynamical systems, and AI. And AI has become quite a bit of a buzzword as well. So so the fact that already from that time it's already being discussed really shows that actually there's a long history to some subjects that are quite hot or quite interesting now, but they really do have that long history. So really, it's been really very good to get the context.
Okay, great. So a couple of points before I start to talk about the relevance of complexity science for asset management is, first of all, I'll use the word patterns a lot in this conversation, I think, and it's a word that's used a lot by complexity scientists, or at least the ones I know. And we think of those as structured relationships between the parts or actors in the system. And it's quite a vague term, so let me be clear about what I mean. It's things like technologies such as circuit boards, or how they have patterns of they have they're patterned in a way that kind of controls the flow of information, but also things like business processes, and just the way that some companies or organizations set up their processes to kind of so there's a flow of information and resources and so forth. Social norms I mentioned earlier are a good example, but also you can think of sports teams and the tactics they use, like set pieces in football. right? Those are kind of patterns that are designed to sort of win a game. So the idea of patterns is quite broad. The second final point I'll make by way of context is this, that it's very tempting to think of complexity science as sitting to the side of the mechanistic mindset and sort of being just a different perspective. But I think it's really important, and I realize what I'm going to say is slightly contentious. It's important to understand, I think, that complexity science is a generalization of the mechanistic mindset. And what do I mean by that? So if you look at Thomas Kuhn's work on paradigm changes in science, he made the point that most or all paradigm changes, the new paradigm is a generalization of the previous paradigm, which is to say that, so I'll give the example of classical physics and Einstein. So Einstein basically showed that classical physics is a special case of relativity, general relativity. And also within economics, we have orthodox economics, and something I discussed in my PhD thesis is if you break down complexity economics into various features, if you take each of those features and then constrain it sufficiently, you arrive at orthodox theory. Okay, so complexity economics, in my opinion, is essentially a generalization in economics. So I think that's important, because I don't want the audience to think that complexity science is just a different perspective. Actually, in a sense, it's a meta perspective that actually values and can include, in a sense, the mechanistic mindset, and realizes that that can be helpful in many different contexts. But it also recognizes that that framing isn't particularly relevant in other contexts that are much more sort of complex and fluid. So I think those two things are really important. Am I being clear?
Yeah.
I hope I'm not being too abstract about this. That's kind of one of my concerns.
No, I think the clarifiers which you put there are very important. The firstly is, again, the mechanistic mindset. There are situations where you would want to adopt that sort of thinking, and then there's others where complexity and that sort of is more suitable. And then also, again, you're sort of differentiating that it's not about it's not a completely different perspective. Again, as you say, it can sit on top of the mechanistic mindset. And I think that's important, because, again, this is not some detached theory, but actually all of these things, you can create links and think about together. And so, yeah, that's important, particularly for the financial industry, as we have some methodologies. And so we're thinking about, other methodologies. And I think having that connection is, very, is important.
Okay. Great. Excellent. I'm glad I'm being relatively clear. But I realize the difficulty here is we have a finite amount of time, but these things are very abstract, and they're big subjects that a lot of philosophers have got their hands dirty in, and they're quite difficult to kind of grasp in simple ways without losing people in deeply philosophical terms. Okay, so what I'll do now is now address the question that you asked, which is what is the relevance of this field for asset managers.
Yeah.
And I have to say, I'm very motivated by practicalities. I really want to ensure that any theoretical work in this area isn't just vague and abstract, that it's actually directly relevant and actually supports investment management.
Yeah.
I think the first point I would say that a lot of the theory in finance, and also specifically directed at asset management, a lot of it's actually founded on the mechanistic mindset. So if you look at things like modern portfolio theory and capital asset pricing models and arbitrage pricing theory, that actually a lot of those are built on the foundations of the mechanistic mindset. And there's also an assumption of what we call ergodicity within that framework. I won't go into that into detail, because that's a very complicated subject. But so there are a bunch of assumptions from the mechanistic mindset that actually has made its way into theory. And actually what we find is that a lot of asset managers have a tendency to ignore a lot of this theory because it's unrealistic. Okay. So I was back at my old college having a reunion a few weeks ago, and I was speaking to one of my friends who was a successful asset manager. I said, "Do you use any theory at all in what you do?" "No." Okay. And it's there's a whole conversation as to why that's the case. But so that's one point I've made. But I'd also make the broader point that the mechanistic mindset is pretty ubiquitous, and it kind of gets, we've, all of us in the West really have been educated and grown up in the West, will have the mechanistic mindset in our mental models, right? We often treat the world in that way, in a general sense, and it can help in some ways. If you know, if I'm catching a bus to get here, that mechanistic mindset of kind of, well, I need to kind of queue up and then get on the bus and so on and so forth, and lots of cause and effect, and it can be really helpful. But actually, so a lot of our general thinking. So if asset managers ignore theory, I think the mechanistic mindset still creeps in to decision making. Okay, so it's, I think those two broad points are I think important in terms of what's the relevance of complexity science for asset management. So now I think what I'll quickly do is talk about the paper I've written called Complexity Arbitrage.
Yes.
And that's relevant here because what the premise of that paper is essentially starts with the points I've just made, which is a lot of asset prices have been formed or have been heavily influenced by the mechanistic mindset, right? By asset managers just applying that mindset. And I should say, I'm not being critical of anyone here. I've grown up with this mindset. I've had to spend a lot of time thinking away from it and sort of rewiring my mind. But I've grown up in this mindset. I worked in a pension fund, in a hedge fund, and I was using that way of thinking when I was making decisions and making sense of things. So I'm guilty of it as well. So I'm not being critical of people. But so complexity arbitrage starts with this point that that prices are essentially heavily influenced by financial prices are heavily influenced by the mechanistic mindset. And my opinion is that if you take complexity science and you start to make sense of your context with complexity science and make decisions with it, you can improve your decision making within asset management. And that's not just about making more money. That's about kind of managing risk and uncertainty better. Yes. That's about, considering environmental, social, and governance features as well. And also managing, your assets better over time. So the ergodicity, non-ergodicity theme within complexity science shows that actually we need to be careful about how we think of returns over time. So that's the general point. And I should obviously flag that I'm using arbitrage before people kind of contact me and say you're using arbitrage in a terrible way. I am using it in a very general way, right? So I know that arbitrage has a certain technical definition in the finance literature, but I'm using it in a very broad sense that you can basically improve how you make decisions and run your portfolios better using complexity science. So that's it. That's my answer to your question. I realize I've probably taken 10 minutes to answer your question. Do you have any? How does that sit with you?
Yeah. No, I think the one point as well is it's just hearing what you had to say is sort of the educational context, right? I think, maybe there's a way of thinking or the way that, whether it's schools or universities, maybe there's a certain structure to the methodologies that were introduced. And so as you learn that and you take that within your, within your job or, within your, as an asset manager, I suppose that sort of carries on. So, and I think, and that's a whole, another subject on the educational part, of course, that we could sit down and talk about, and how that's from sort of financial thinking. But I just thought that was really interesting because again, it adds another dimension into, okay, we're using these methods as well, but where are we hearing about these methods? And so I think, thinking about this area, it's not just about, doing it in practice, but also actually how could those ideas be formed, even at the early stages when we're at school or university.
Yeah.
So, that was very, interesting to hear. Okay. I just wanted to touch on something, you just mentioned about sort of uncertainty and risk. And maybe that's something we can sort of delve a little bit more, deeply into, because
actually, can we pause a second? Because you had a question that you were planning to ask more about.
Yes, one of the questions, just before we touch onto that, is maybe just thinking, okay, we've talked about complexity and sort of systems thinking in finance. And maybe it's good as well to provide sort of more context if we could name, or we can maybe mention some individuals or firms who are adopting such thinking.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm definitely not alone in this area. Although, in terms of, I'll mention a whole bunch of names that I really appreciate and value their work. But it's difficult to, there's a boundary problem here. I don't know where to kind of draw the line, because there's some work in, for example, evolutionary finance, which is excellent. Some of my colleagues at Santana are working in this, plus other people. And so that, but they're working in finance in general, not necessarily specifically asset management. And there's also the question about where do you draw the line of complexity science, because evolutionary finance is kind of a cousin of complexity science. But I'll just cherry pick the people that I've really come to appreciate over time. And so I'll start with the academics, and I would first of all say Brian Arthur, who set up the economics department. So, well, actually, he was the first person to run the economics department at the Santa Fe Institute, and he and his colleagues did some great work on what they call the artificial stock market, and that's got some really great value there. We can dive into that deeper if you want. I'd say in London, actually, there's the London Mathematical Laboratory under Ollie Peters and Colm Connaughton. They've done a lot of great work on this issue of non-ergodicity. So I would tip my hat to them. And there's also Doyne Farmer and Eric Beinhocker in INET at Oxford. Doyne in particular has done some really great work with modeling and promoting the use of agent-based modeling, which I think is fantastic. But I would also mention the second category of people I would mention. I call them bridging people that both work in academia a bit and also in sort of real world asset management. And you had Rick Bookstaber here 2 or 3 weeks ago, and he wrote a great book a few years ago on this subject. So Rick is great to listen to. He understands what's going on here. There's also a couple of people at the CFA Institute who recently wrote a paper on reframing financial markets, which is yourself and Genevieve Hayman. So that was obviously a delight for me to read, and it was quite cathartic to read something from the CFA Institute on this subject. I would flag also a friend, colleague of mine, Graham Boyd, who's trying to operationalize this point of non-ergodicity in his company Evolute 6. And also I'd mention Jean-Philippe Bouchard at Capital Fund Management. Jean-Philippe is a little bit more on the sort of quantity econophysicsy side, and that's not a criticism. He's done a lot of really good theoretical work, and he's made money in asset management. So I have to tip my hat to him as well. Asset management companies, this is particularly interesting for me, is that there are actually a couple of worth mentioning as well as capital fund management. Then these are more on the fundamental side of asset management, which is Baillie Gifford and a smaller company called NZS Capital that's based in Colorado. Baillie Gifford's in Edinburgh. These, as I say, are more on the fundamental side. And Baillie Gifford's has been here in this area for a few years now, and actually invested some money in this area. So Doyne Farmer, who I mentioned just now, is the Baillie Gifford Professor of Complexity Science. They've also funded Ollie Peters' work at the London Mathematical Laboratory on non-ergodicity. So they've actually put their money where their mouth is. And I've listened to some of their asset managers, and one of them in London was just talking about Stuart Kaufman, who's a big name in the complexity science world. So definitely tip my hat to Baillie Gifford. There's also, so I mentioned also NZS, run by Brinton Johns and Brad Slingerland. They have a really cool paper on their website. So if you Google NZS Capital, Brinton's pretty much my age, so there's lots of really cool 80s pop culture references in their white paper, and it's quite amusing. The last thing I mentioned in terms of people is actually to mention of someone specific who I've never met, but I understand. So this is James Anderson. He was at Baillie Gifford for quite a few years, and my understanding is that he took quite a significant role in bringing complexity science into their thinking. He's now a managing partner in London at Lingotto Investment Management. So I would those are the people that I've cherry picked, and I hope I haven't defended anyone by not mentioning them. So that would be my answer to your question. But there is one last thing I would say, if you don't mind. I was thinking about what to say in this podcast, and I think there's what I think there are two ways in terms of practical implications of complexity science for asset managers on the ground who are managing money.
Yeah.
I think it's a good idea to think of two waves. And the first wave is that we can take complexity science as it is in a sort of general sense, and think through what are the implications that we can work out from that, and talk to asset managers and sort of, and so I've spent a couple of years thinking about that general complexity sort of field and a lot of the principles and concepts that come from it, and thinking about the practical relevance for asset managers. And my paper, Complexity Arbitrage, is essentially about that. But I would also, but I would say there's a second wave that we're still waiting for, right? And what I would say is that we need to do a lot of theoretical work, I think, to stitch complexity science together with asset management, right? And what I mean by that is that I'm not aware of anyone addressing questions like, what is the complexity science equivalent of modern portfolio theory? What is the complexity science equivalent of arbitrage pricing theory or the efficient markets hypothesis? All these foundational things within orthodox finance, I don't really see anyone, I don't see any research centers focused on those questions. So I think the second wave is going to have to be, probably hundreds of people, years of research, across potentially multiple research teams to really think about this question of stitching the two together. So there's a lot of work that kind of looks at complexity science and sort of finance sort of side by side, but there is much less about kind of just stitching them together and saying, well, what are the implications? Let's talk to the asset managers and let's kind of unpack this and replace modern portfolio theory with different theories. And I think that work will lead to a second wave of practical implications. And I think that's partly what I want to work on. So I think that's a useful way of thinking.
Yeah. No, yeah. First of all, yeah, I think you've just given sort of the breadth, again, from sort of for academic and industry and people that bridge between the two who are, very much active and working in this space. From my own background, because I did a PhD in financial maths, I'm aware of some of the, individuals that you mentioned, like Bouchard and Dorian Farmer, who focus more on the sort of the quantitative side of, complexity. But, really sort of got a wider range of people. I think it's, again, just speaking to sort of the breadth and who's, very much invested in, in this area. And then the second thing as well, I mean, talking about sort of maybe the change in the second wave and, really thinking about more sort of complexity and finance together. And I think that's going to require such a, a monumental effort, and in terms of not just those in academia, but then industry and, all of them working together to really think about these questions deeply. And I'm sure that's not going to be an easy process, particularly when we think about those challenges now, but then how that's going to evolve in the next 10, 20, 50 years.
Absolutely. And I should say that you're bang on, that I think on the quant side, there is more going on to kind of shifting between academia and asset management, if you can include quant trading and quant approaches. There's a lot more that's going on there, and say Jean-Philippe is also on that side of things and on the quant side and trying to apply complexity science. So there's more going on the quant side, but my own motivation is more on the fundamental side. I'm motivated by the fact that the asset management industry manages something like $130 trillion of assets, right? And we need to make sure that money is channeled for the good of humanity, generally speaking. So I'm really interested I'm more interested in the fundamental side of asset management.
Yeah, that's great. So again, I hope that, for our listeners, really, again, giving the historical, the definitions of complexity that we'll be talking about, and some of just the key players, or, a few of the key players within this space, again, really sort of highlighting the sort of the depth of range, which complexity has in finance. I like to, at this part, maybe dig a little deeper into maybe a few areas of complexity. And of course, we can only scratch the surface given the sort of the depth and sort of the range of topics. But again, I think it'll be, very interesting to, delve a little bit deeper into, a few things, and particularly those areas which are quite relevant to, asset management.
Sure.
So One of the things that you had mentioned actually is sort of uncertainty and risk. And maybe we can just unpack that a little more, because, sometimes, when we discuss them, we talk about them in the same way. And so, in finance, for example, when we discuss risk, we're often evaluating, say, an asset's performance in terms of risk versus return. So in this case, the potential gains compared to the possible losses. And again, as mentioned, we sometimes use these sort of terms together, uncertainty and risk, but they do refer to different things. So maybe, Greg, for our listeners, maybe you can just explain how uncertainty differs from risk, and why understanding this distinction is particularly important from a complexity perspective that matters for asset management.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is one of my favorite subjects. The first point to mention, though, is that you don't have to be an expert or be familiar with complexity science to understand this distinction, right? And to value it. But I find that the complexity perspective sort of helps to understand it, and I'll kind of explain why. So let me start by defining some terms, and especially defining how I understand risk and uncertainty. And it's actually pretty standard definition. So I'm not this is not just my opinion. And also there's a third term, which is ambiguity, but which I'll mention briefly.
Yes.
So when we're thinking about context and sort of when we have a context that we're interested in, and we're trying to work out what the outcomes of that context is, and it could be just simply looking at the price of a particular financial security. So there are two questions that we ask in this area. One is, do we know what all the outcomes are? Okay. And in some contexts, like if we're rolling a die, yes, we know. If we're rolling a fair die, we know there's 6 outcomes. Okay. In other contexts, like, sort of the war in Ukraine, if we're trying to work out what the outcome of that is, that's a much more complex question. And there are far more outcomes than we can possibly sit down and list.
Yeah.
So in one context, we can say, yes, we know the outcomes. And in other contexts, we say, actually, we don't know all the outcomes. So the second question then is, if we do know the outcomes, do we know how likely they are to occur? Okay, or what's the probability of those outcomes? So again, throwing a fair die, we know that the probability is 1/6 for each of the outcomes. But even if we could imagine some scenarios in Ukraine, it's probably difficult to pin down a probability. We could imagine some subjective probabilities, but it's much more difficult. So this leads us to a neat 2x2 diagram, if you like, where we have 4 quadrants, where you have so on the outcomes we have known and unknown, and on probabilities we know what they are or we don't know what they are. Okay. And risk is defined by situations where we know what the outcomes are and we know the corresponding probabilities. So this is classic, risk, sort of probability density functions are is what we're talking about.
Yes.
Here, right?
Yes.
So that's one. So that's risk. Uncertainty is when we don't know the outcomes, and of course that means we don't know what the probabilities of any outcomes are.
Yeah.
Right. So that's where we're in the realm of we just don't know. Okay. So that's uncertainty, and I'm going to throw in ambiguity whilst we're talking about this. That's where we know what the potential outcomes are, but we don't know the probability of those outcomes. Okay. So like I say, it's helpful to think of this in terms of like a 2x2 matrix, and whether we know the outcomes and whether we know the probabilities or not. So that's where I would start. Is that clear at the moment?
Yeah, no, definitely. I think it's good. Exactly. Again, the differentiation of the risk uncertainty, and sort of, what are those outcomes, and the probability of those outcomes. Those are sort of two kind of quite distinctions there. And so that for risk, we know, how those, we know what those outcomes are generated and the probabilities of those outcomes. But then uncertainty, we have that unknown, as you're mentioning. So no, actually that's absolutely clear.
Great. Okay, so I should also, whilst I'm thinking about it, tip my hat to both Frank Knight and John Maynard Keynes, who really who really initiated this discussion of uncertainty. So with those definitions in mind, I would say the mechanistic mindset, so this is going back to the discussion earlier, actually has 2 different ways of thinking about this. The strong form of the mechanistic mindset is where you have a perfect clockwork universe where there's no risk and no uncertainty. And that's where basically you know everything there is to know about your context. And you can predict everything perfectly. Okay, so there's no risk, right? And there's no uncertainty at all. But the weaker form of the mechanistic mindset is open to risk. Okay, so it accepts that we can't predict the future, but the extent to which we don't know is knowable, right? So we have so it assumes a probability density function, and that's okay in some contexts, like rolling a die, right?
Yes.
So that's where I would say that that's where the mechanistic mindset comes in, is that the weaker form does accept risk, but it doesn't accept uncertainty. And I'm talking in very general terms here. So that's where we're at in terms of risk and uncertainty. Now, one of the things I did in my PhD research was to dive further into the nature of uncertainty, because complexity science is much more open to the fact that we just often don't know what's going on, right, or what's going to happen. And so in my PhD research, I found I was looking at various literatures like institutional economics and game theory and complexity science, and actually I discovered 5 different what I'm going to call sources of uncertainty, right? So instead of just talking about uncertainty in quite a vague way and sort of binary, things are uncertain or not, it's actually really helpful to identify and just acknowledge these 5 sources. And I'm not claiming these are exhaustive. I'm just saying I've seen these in the literature and they're worth unpacking and discussing. So once you open your mind to uncertainty, you kind of, this is helpful as a way to frame those different sorts of uncertainty. So, and I'll quickly run through these. And by the way, I am ignoring the uncertainty linked to quantum mechanics. So Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, yes, I'm aware of that, but I'm just pushing that aside as not particularly relevant here. And maybe it is relevant, but I'm not aware that.
But maybe another conversation.
Yes, that's going beyond my expertise. So let me quickly run through these 5, and these are massive subjects. But I have to just skip across the surface because we don't have too long. So the first one, and I'm going to go from the sort of easier and weaker forms of uncertainty and progressively work towards the sort of more complicated and the stronger forms of uncertainty. So the first is the most obvious, which is where you just lack data. So you're in some context and you just lack some raw information, right? You might need to know how many cars are crossing London Bridge right now for some reason, right? So that's just pure data, and that's the obvious form of uncertainty. The second is often conflated with that, and that's about knowledge. And knowledge and data are treated very different, both in philosophy and also in complexity science. Knowledge is about how contexts are patterned. Okay, so it's about how phenomena relate to other phenomena. Okay, it's not so much about data. It's about, you have a bunch of people within an organization, and there's a kind of informal friendship network or network amongst colleagues that you don't know about, right? But that's knowledge, to kind of know who everyone is connected to within that organization. That's a sort of knowledge. And obviously this links to scientific research, right? We're unearthing the laws of the universe is all about knowledge. Okay, so that's the second form of uncertainty, and so that just means we don't know something. Okay, the third one is what I'm going to call limited human cognition. So the universe is vast, the economy is vast, and we are sitting here with limited amounts of ability to store information and process information, right? So in a sense, we're kind of ants on an anthill in a way, staring at the universe. So our cognition is limited, and that goes beyond the simple stuff that's discussed in economics on what's it called, the rationality. It's gone in my head. This was bounded rationality. So this goes beyond bounded rationality. This is about the genuine way in which human cognition is limited. So things might be going on that we might know, which are knowable in principle, but we can't process because we have limited ability to process information, right? The fourth, so those first three are discussed a lot by Douglas North, who won the Nobel Prize for his work in institutional economics. And he has a book in the early 90s where he discusses those three. The fourth one, this is where we start to get a little bit more complicated. And the fourth source of uncertainty is what I'm calling mutual contingency in expectations formation. And that's quite a complicated phrase, but it's basically where, let's say you and I are driving along the road, and I have to form expectations. Let's say there are no rules of the road.
Okay.
Right. I have to form expectations about what you're going to do in order to decide what I'm going to do. Right. So I'm driving on the road and you're driving, and we might meet. And I might think you're going to turn or whatever, or format, but you're trying to do the same thing to me. Right. And actually what happens is we can get into a situation where there's paralysis, because I'm trying to anticipate you, who's trying to anticipate me, who's trying to anticipate you. Yeah. So there's what we call an infinite regress problem. And so that can actually lead to paralysis in the situation, or mistakes being made. Yeah. So, we could be driving along the motorway, and if I misjudge, if I get the wrong expectation about you, we could both die.
Yes.
Okay, so this is about expectation formation. There are lots of situations where we just don't know what other people are going to do, right? And then the fifth source of uncertainty is what I'm just going to call genuine novelty, and this is where this is the strongest form of uncertainty. This is where phenomena just emerge that we can't even anticipate in principle, right? They just happen, okay? And they're novel, which means that we can't anticipate them by definition. Yeah. Okay. That's a deep subject, but I won't go too far into it. There's a phrase called ontological emergence, which links to it, which I won't go into because it'll take half an hour to unpack. So those are those five sources of uncertainty. And what I'm going to do is make one point, and then I'll pause just to check I'm being comprehensible here.
Yes.
The last point I'd make is that in the context of how I've defined risk and uncertainty and discuss uncertainty, I would argue that asset management is more about uncertainty than risk. Okay, so I'd say actually most of what asset managers do is actually to try and mitigate uncertainty, to try and understand what's going on in their context, and that risk is more the domain of the insurance companies. Okay, because risk is about stable probability distributions, and you need that to be able to price insurance. So I would say, and it's a broad sweeping statement, that I think that asset management is more about uncertainty than risk. It's not only about uncertainty. There are parts of risk. And the last point I'll make before pausing, I realize that's the second time I've said I'm going to make a point and then pause. The last point I'll make is that I know very well that really good risk managers understand what I'm talking about, and they're already there. They know the difference between the two, and they also know that their job is mostly about uncertainty management, not risk management. So I know that there are people out there that understand this. So this is not just something new I'm saying. I'm saying there are people that do understand this. And I've talked to them. I've talked to a few of these people. But the important point is that the mechanistic mindset pulls us in one direction to talk only about risk, but reality sort of pulls us in the other direction and appreciate uncertainty, but we're sort of caught in the middle.
Yes.
Between those two. So I'll pause there. I have a few things to talk about in terms of the practical implications of this. Yeah. But I'll pause there and just check that this is going down okay.
Yeah, no, I think, and as well, again, I think things I'm taking away is, uncertainty, and you're packing the different types of uncertainty, and that's important, and I think, for example, I'm thinking about sort of the information, or maybe the limited information. I think that can also be from a perspective, right? Because some maybe I have access to data, and so there's one part of uncertainty that, doesn't apply to me, but for somebody else, they don't have access into that information, and so they have high uncertainty within that area.
Absolutely.
So, even when we're talking about the same uncertainty or type of uncertainty, the level of that uncertainty, even with different, individuals or firms, will vary, for example, based on the information that, you have.
And also, if you don't mind, that very much is important when it comes to knowledge and expertise. So you might have some expertise about some context that someone else doesn't. So that context is less uncertain for you than it is for them.
Yes, exactly. No, and again, exactly, and that, you know, that's again very, very important as well, to mention there. Um, I also was thinking, again, because just mentioning at the start, but very much a sort of, AI, and I'm thinking about, how that applies particularly as well, within the asset management context. And I'm thinking as well, I think the particular part with the mutual contingency, say, we had systems, or AI systems where everyone adopts one. And so there's a sort of a predictability or known, because the decisions which the AI will make on a certain decision, and so the other AI systems are able to predict that, and so there's sort of a unison there. You know, is that, I'm just thinking, if we're going down that path, or if it's heading down that direction where things are becoming much more automized, and there's much more within AI, does that eliminate one of those? Well, we're beginning to eliminate one of those uncertainties, or not? I know, just
No, that's an excellent. That really is an excellent question, because there are, if you start to think about the practical implications of each of these sources of uncertainty, then in one simple sense, AI can help you with knowledge, for example. So we know that some researchers have used AI entities to research antibiotics and to identify new antibiotics, right? So that to me is knowledge. That's kind of discovering new knowledge, and that's incredibly exciting. So that's where AI can help. Another point is that if we have limited human cognition, AI can supplement that cognition,
Yes,
right? So it's a second form of uncertainty that the AI can help with. But you're absolutely right, and I was thinking we might end up talking about this a little bit more in detail later. But the main risk with AI, or one of the risks, is related to model collapse. I don't know if you're familiar with this.
actually, I think I have, maybe again, we can discuss this well for our viewers, but I know that there's a paper by one of my colleagues at CFA Institute, James Tate, that talks about synthetic data, and that concept of the model collapse does actually apply when you're, generating, data from, a given process. But maybe again, just give our viewers,
Well, yes, I mean, it's so model collapse is, I'm not an expert in AI, but my understanding is where you have, let's say, two AI entities that are making decisions and generating some output, and they're basically both doing that, but both learning from each other. So they're both using each other's output to train, right? And model collapse is basically where that training essentially turns into gibberish, right? And the AI just learns something that is, they basically just both, the models, the AI models collapse in the sense that they're no longer useful in the real world, okay? And they come out with ideas that are just completely gibberish. So that's one of the problems with AI. I'll just pause there and say, I did think about AI and this, I made quite a few notes about it.
Yeah.
So maybe it's better to kind of like push the AI conversation to a bit later.
Yes, yeah,
because
sure.
because there's some really interesting stuff to dive into,
Okay.
and I don't want to get too diverted from risk and uncertainty.
Sounds good.
So maybe what I can do now is quickly, because I, as I say, I'm really motivated by the practical question, and for each of these sources, you can think about what are the practical implications, for in general, but also for asset managers. So what I'll quickly do, and again, it's frustrating because this is a fascinating subject that we can dive really deeply into, but we don't have too long. So let me quickly whittle through what I think are some of the implications of what I've said on risk and uncertainty.
Yes.
And feel free to jump in if any thoughts come to you. So I mean, I think first point is that knowing the distinction between risk and uncertainty and ambiguity is itself really powerful, because if we're really too influenced by the mechanistic mindset, then we're trying to just jam everything into risk. We're trying to model it. We're trying to claim that well, one of the implications is that we're trying to find a future probability distribution, and force ourselves to find it when actually none might exist, right? It might not exist at all. So actually differentiating between these and accepting that there might not be a probability distribution to find is quite powerful. And this links to what I call my first lesson in complexity science, which is humility. Okay. So if once you start to emphasize uncertainty, then you get into this, you start to say, well, actually, that we don't know that much about everything, right? And that actually we need to be a little bit humble. So that's my first letter. Anyway, so the next point I'd say is that that if we're in some context, this framework can be quite useful to kind of almost in a checklist sense. It's like, well, if we're looking at this context and we're like, I don't know, Brazil, what's the nature of uncertainty, right? So if we're thinking about buying some emerging market debt from Brazil, what is the uncertainty we're facing? And you can kind of run through this as a checklist in a sense, to say, actually, yes, you might end up saying, actually, most of the problem is just knowledge. Right, or we need to simulate, use computer simulations to kind of imagine the future. So those are sort of two broad points. But then I quickly run through for each of these sources where I think some of the implications lie. So the first one, which is raw data, it's obvious and simple, which is you go and find more data, or go and buy it, or go and employ someone that has that data, or something like that. The second one about knowledge is obviously you need to go out and do your research and acquire and find the knowledge that you need. But one of the interesting things is that the mechanistic mindset tends to treat knowledge as a once and for all problem, and so it's like, because all we need to do is understand how a context is patterned now. And it's pretty much not going to change over time, right? Because the mechanistic mindset tends to assume that things don't change within a context. Whereas the complexity mindset says actually no, contexts do change, right? And what that essentially means is that you should be continuously learning. You can't just study something once and for all. You've got to be continuously learning and updating. And we know this in a pragmatic sense. But it's, again, I'm just identifying the tension between the mechanistic mindset and kind of reality, is that we tend to be kind of pulled in two different directions. So the third source of uncertainty was limited human cognition. And I would say that there are obvious ways that, and we've talked about AI, and I would say those are cognitive annexes, right? Computers are obviously cognitive annexes, and they allow us to store information and process it. That's obvious. But also in terms of unassisted cognition, the larger and more complicated as a domain, and again, I'd come back to Ukraine, the more you actually need multiple perspectives. So if I were, I don't know, the Secretary General of the United Nations, and I wanted to understand what's going on in Ukraine deeply, I would pull together experts in the military, in geopolitics, experts in the region, psychologists, economists, etc. And this relates to a concept that came out of cybernetics called requisite variety. And it's this idea that actually it's really healthy to have variety in some contexts. And here it's about deploying expertise or knowledge in a way for you to make sense of the context. And we kind of know that, but again, there is a tendency sometimes to try to kind of just say we just need to find everything out about the context, and we can do that ourselves without experts. And this actually links to this wonderful phrase, multi-perspectivalism, and this is the idea of just valuing multiple perspectives on a subject. So the fourth source of uncertainty I discussed was about this mutual contingency problem in expectation formation. And there's lots of different ways. And this is about stabilizing expectations. And in institutional economics, this is discussed a lot because institutions like social norms and some regulations and some laws are there to stabilize expectations. So the rules of the road I mentioned earlier, I know that you're going to drive on a particular side of the road. I know what you're likely to do at traffic lights. I know what you're likely to do at roundabouts and so on, and also on the motorway when we're both going in the same direction. The rules of the road are there to stabilize expectations, partly to keep people safe, okay, or actually to make journeys more efficient. Right? So, but the broader fields or the broader concepts of coordination and cooperation are important here, because there are lots of different ways we cooperate and coordinate in the world. This is very much the sort of broad theme of my PhD thesis. And a lot of those forms, coordination and cooperation, they stabilize expectations. Okay. And so we can think again about sports teams' tactics as well. So like when you have a set piece in football and all the players know exactly what everyone else is going to do for the set piece to work and score a goal. But I also mentioned Steve Jobs talked about his role as the CEO of Apple as being like the conductor of the orchestra, right?
Yes.
So all of these types of things, because he was criticized by coders because they said, you've never coded anything in your life, right? And you're running basically a software and hardware company. And his response was, look, I'm the conductor of the orchestra, right? You're the string section, right? And that's fine. And you do a great job, but I'm the conductor. So there are lots of different ways in which we stabilize expectations. And even when you're looking at corporations, corporate strategies, the most effective corporate strategies are ways of coordinating the actions of all the people in the organization, right? So really good strategies. Everyone's on board with those strategies if they've been formed bottom up and are legitimate. But that can really help people know what everyone else is going to do in the organization, so they know what they have to do. Okay, so that's the fourth source of uncertainty, and then the fifth source I mentioned is genuine novelty, and it's tempting to think actually we can't predict this. We can't predict by nature. We can't predict novel future events, right? In terms of because this is strongly novel events that happen in the future that we can't predict. But actually, you can handle these in a second order sense in that you can be prepared for the unexpected. Okay, so instead of trying to predict the future, you just accept that the future's uncertain, and you position yourself to. And the words I would use are resilience, agility, and dexterity. And so those are the different ways in which we've mitigated these forms of uncertainty, and they're more. I mean, they're pretty generalizable, but in terms of they're relevant in lots of different fields.
Yes.
But they obviously have relevance for asset managers in making decisions about portfolios and assets that they long or short.
Yeah.
So the last thing I would say before drawing a line under this is that this does not mean that we need to throw away all risk management tools and models at all, not at all. There's a lot of really good work on the ground that responds to the uncertain nature of reality, and like I say, lots of risk managers understand uncertainty. So there's lots of things going on, and I'm not saying that it should all be disposed of and we need to start all over again.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm drawing a line under there. That's my long answer to your question about risk and uncertainty.
No, thank you. And I think, you've really detailed and addressed each of those points of uncertainty in the ways that we can, address or, be more comfortable with that. And I think for what I'm taking away, one of those key messages is about, again, being comfortable. A lot of the time of uncertainty, there are a lot of unknowns and that it may stay like that. But I think, within asset management, being aware of, what areas of uncertainty that you may be exposed to, and then thinking about your positions and what you can do to be more resilient and adaptive. As you say, I think it's really important. And I think as well, when we're thinking about, we're more interconnected in terms of the information that we have, I think having that more agility and adaptiveness will become ever more important.
Yeah, I completely agree.
Yeah. Great. Thank you. So, that was, our discussions there on sort of uncertainty and risk. And really just sort of following on from that, I wanted to talk a little bit about modeling, which does follow quite smoothly on, I could think, from uncertainty and risk, and how sometimes we may quantify, some of those risk aspects. So here, maybe just providing sort of a high level, particularly of models and financial models in finance, and really they're sort of used to capture sort of an abstract representation of a real world financial situation. Such situations involve a range of tasks, including decision making, valuation, forecasting, and risk management, all of which are assisted by, or in many cases driven by, financial modeling. However, modeling the underlying complexities of financial markets presents significant challenges. Models are by necessity simplifications. They abstract away much of the messiness and unpredictability of real-world dynamics. In this regard, how do you see the use of models for asset management, particularly when accounting for the complexity in financial markets?
Yeah. Again, I find these subjects fascinating, and I could talk for hours, but we don't have time for that. So yeah. So let me start again by with the mechanistic mindset and how that. I should emphasize that often this mechanistic mindset is a straw person or a straw man in older language, and that I don't think there's a single person that thinks in such an extreme way, but it's a helpful orientation because we are biased towards thinking in this way. I think by how we've learned growing up. So the mechanistic mindset, I'd say, has a number of features. One is it tends to promote this philosophical term called positivism, and what that means is there's the idea that everything can be captured, measured, and formalized. Okay, so if you're looking at a context, you should be able to model it perfectly and quantify it perfectly, and just formalize the whole thing, so that we just know how the whole context works, right? There's also an assumption, the second point I'd make about the mechanistic mindset, there's also an assumption that patterns are broadly stable within contexts, or rather the context is static. And you can think of, the mathematicians can think of a bunch of simultaneous differential equations, where the equations are actually static, but the system can still evolve, its variables change, right? But the equations are, which you'll understand better than I do. And also the third point I'd make is that there's generally an assumption that there's similarity across contexts. Okay, so one financial market over here in equities is very similar to a financial market in equities over here. Okay, so there's sort of similarities between concepts. And that mindset can give rise to a number of mistakes, and a lot of it tends to be sophisticated extrapolation, I would say, right? And I give a good example of this is sort of vanilla value at risk models, where you look at historical data, you calibrate your variance covariance matrix, so you have some sense of future volatility, and then you make the assumption that the future is going to be pretty much the same as the past. So you then say, like, at the 5% confidence level, that we might lose this amount or more, right? And I'm not saying that that's totally useless at all. I'm just saying that's a good example of the mechanistic mindset. And that number can be really useful, right? It can be better having that number than not, provided that the users of that number know exactly what it is. And there's a kind of assumption that sort of history repeats itself. So that's I think a good example of what I'm talking about when I mentioned the mechanistic mindset. And it's interesting, we don't need to go into this in detail, but it's the efficient markets hypothesis tends to encourage that type of thinking, that actually this variance covariance matrix will stay the same in the future. Okay. So that aside, if I can address those 3 points from a complexity science perspective. And I'd say that, well, first of all, not everything can be captured, measured, and formalized. We kind of know that in pragmatic terms, but it sort of accepts that actually a lot of things are qualitative, and we can't measure everything, and we can't capture everything in a formal model. There's also the second point, which is, like I've said, I actually mentioned this before, that the idea that contexts change over time and that the underlying patterns change. So thinking about differential equations, the equations themselves might change, right? So systems can repattern themselves in unpredictable ways. For example, new technology might just hit the context, and then the whole context is kind of blown up, like a deck of cards thrown into the air. But also context can vary, right? I mean, we kind of know this pragmatically, but again, the mechanistic mindset sort of encourages you to think in other ways. So let me pause there and just check if that's all. There's a whole bunch of things I want to say from that broad introduction, but I'll just stop and check if that's all okay.
Yeah, no, exactly. And I think you've really highlighted some, really good points in terms of modeling. And I think when I think about modeling and, how we motivate sometimes models, we do look at that historical context. And a lot of it is, history driven. What events have happened in the past? What risks have we been exposed to in the past? And we try to extrapolate from that to say that those potentially are the main focuses of risk that we should think about in the future. But, from a systems perspective, that's not necessarily the case. And that's because those systems change because of the regulation, new technologies, is saying key players. I think that's really important, not only to be aware of, but then to also adapt our models and the way we analyze risk from that perspective.
Absolutely.
So really interesting.
Yeah, thank you. And I should flag for the listeners that you do have a lot of expertise in this area. So for this area, please chip in and tell me if I'm talking nonsense.
It's a pleasure to hear you speak. Of course.
Okay. So what I'll do is I'll run through a few points that I think are offered about models from the complexity science perspective. So let me just sort of run through. First of all, there are some complexity scientists who say that we really shouldn't use any models at all, right? That actually we can't capture the complexity of context, so we shouldn't try, and it's dangerous to try. And I don't agree with that, really. I agree. In some contexts that are very fluid and are kind of repatterning themselves very quickly, I think that's true, because there's no point in kind of trying to create a snapshot, I don't think. If we're interested in the future, creating a snapshot, it suddenly becomes obsolete. So a model can become very quickly obsolete, so if the context is changing fast. But I don't agree generally that models are useless. So let me just quickly pause to read this. So the way I generally view this is, if we take a broad view of modeling and what models are, I would say that we human beings model all of the time with our heads, right? Or within our own cognition. You and I are currently modeling the room we're sitting in, the conversation, right? Your body language, my body. We're creating models in our own minds, cognitive models. So we do that naturally all the time. And I think formal models can be just an extension of what we're already thinking about. So they can be really helpful to express how a context looks like. So I don't think that formal models is really that big a jump from the fact that we do model all the time in our minds. And I think that formal models can help, for example, in being transparent about our own thinking. So if I were to develop a model of some context, you can look at it and go, I think you're missing things there, right? And critique it, and that's helpful. We can also, some of my colleagues at Santana, in complexity science, take groups of people and have modeled context by co-creating a model, by interviewing and discussing with lots of people within a context, and developing an agent-based model based on those conversations, right? And that's really kind of democratic in a way. That's a really powerful way of developing, and then giving feedback. Getting feedback from those participants on the model to kind of improve it. So I think that's a valuable way of doing models. But also talking about limited cognition is that if we can formalize these things, for example, build an agent-based model, often we can simulate. And our minds are not very good at simulating in a way that computers are. So that's another powerful reason why I think that models can be very effective. So that's broadly how I think of it. So I have a bunch of other points, but I thought I'd just pause because I'm really interested in your perspective.
I think because this is an area that, I had done in my part of my PhD, and also with some of my work that I've been doing at CFA Institute. And I think in terms of the communication side has been quite an important part. When you develop a model, and particularly a quantitative model, you're able to, on paper, and particularly formalize some of those thoughts, and some of the complexity that you may want to, which your model shows. And I think, having that can be, is a very useful tool. But at the same time, again, you do make those simplifications and assumptions there. And so you always have to caveat the things, which you develop with your model with, okay, this is the objective. It is trying to capture this. but we're not able to capture all aspects because of A, B, and C. And I think it goes back to sort of the humility part of understanding, okay, what your model can and cannot do.
Absolutely.
Because if the sort of the wrong thing, or potentially something dangerous, is that if you don't know what it can't do, then you use it for a case which actually it's not intended for, or maybe it can't capture. And so that can really sort of, lead to extremely high levels of, of risk, which, your asset allocation or you may face. As an asset manager. So I think that's really important. And again, it's important to recognize the things that models cannot do as well as can. As we're in today's world, we're developing such advanced models, financial, climate, AI, and understanding those limitations is very important.
Absolutely. I completely agree with you. And I'm sort of given your expertise on models, I'm kind of relieved that you have the same sort of perspective as I do. So what I thought I might do is I wrote a few points down whilst I was thinking about this question. So I thought I might unpack those.
Yes.
And then we can carry on discussing it. So I think that one of the key points here is, and this is actually a point that Genevieve emphasized with me the other day, your colleague who wrote the paper on complexity science, is that you've got to be aware of your aims when you're modeling, right? And that tells you sort of what's salient and what's not salient in a model, and also where it's okay to make assumptions and where it's okay to omit certain things. So I think being aware of your aims is really critical, because I think sometimes we can think of modeling as we're trying to create an objective model that does everything. Actually, we just need to know what the aims are, and we just have to be conscious of basically who's using that model, in order to, and that informs how you build a model and what it can contain. So I think that's one of the first points I would make. I would say also, almost stepping outside of modeling, is that, in fact, what you were saying just now about humility and limitations of models, I think there's a counterpart to that, which is to be sensitive and to value qualitative information and qualitative perspectives and expertise on subjects. I think there's a sort of rebalancing from pure quantitative, you've got to model everything, towards actually an appreciation of the sort of qualitative side of analysis and so forth, and research. I would say that within this debate, and this is one of those subjects that we don't have time to delve into too much, but there's a term in this area called instrumentalism, and it's often contrasted with realism. And broadly speaking, instrumentalism in economics and finance borrows quite heavily from Milton Friedman's attitude towards it. And there's this idea that models don't have to be realistic on the inside. If you think of a model as a black box, they don't have to be too realistic as long as they're correlated with your context. Okay. Whereas actually complexity science, I won't go into all the arguments, but complexity science would say that actually models should be realistic. Actually, the content of the model, models are more resilient when they're more realistic, I think. So that's one point I would make. Another point is, Murray Gell-Mann said something quite profound, or this is a phrase that's associated with him. I think he said it in a conference once, which is, imagine how difficult physics would be if electrons could think, right? And that, if you think about it, that's a profound question, or a profound statement, because it kind of points to how complex human domains are, because we are so in a lot of natural systems, we can, broadly speaking, stand aside from them and sort of watch them dispassionately. I'm very aware of the slit screen experiment in quantum mechanics, but generally speaking, in a lot of natural systems, we humans can step outside the context and just observe. But in human systems, if we want to model contexts that include human beings, human mental models are a part of the context. Okay, and that's a really important point that we often, I think, abstract away from. Orthodox economics would say, well, we just assume rationality, or substantive rationality, and okay, that's one approach. But if we want to build relatively realistic models of the context, then we have to have the humans in there. But there's a point that's really powerful that's related to this, which is Soros's reference to reflexivity. And that is about, if you have some context and some people acting in the context, like it could be some industry or some financial market that's focused on some securities, is that you can have the mental models of the people can adjust and they can make different decisions, but then the context changes. And the change in the context can then shift the mental models of the people, right? And then those new mental models, the change in mental models, can change how they make decisions, which then changes the context again. So this is very much related to reflexivity, and it's an important point that basically is this co-evolution between the rest of the context and the human beings. And that's incredibly difficult to pick up in models. And it points, and it goes to your point about, the limitations. Often we just can't pick up those dynamics, and then we have to just accept that we're looking at quite a short time horizon.
Yeah.
So I'll pause there. I've got a few other things to say, but I thought I'd let you.
I was just going to say, I think that point on modeling and what differentiates, say, modeling within, say, finance, economics, social sciences and say, maybe like physics and biology, is the fact that the models that we develop in finance can influence the system, which can in turn influence the models themselves. For example, if in physics, if I come up with a model or maybe a very incorrect model for, say, gravity, that's not going to impact gravity. Gravity will still be 9.81 or whatever number that is.
Absolutely.
But within finance, if I come up with a model and say, if I'm a very large institutional player within a given asset or a given aspect, say, if I'm setting interest rates or inflation and I come up with a model, that will have an effect on those interest rates, inflation, or that asset class.
Absolutely.
And so that's really mindful to have, because again, that sort of feedback, that sort of interaction plays a much bigger part on the modeling side in finance and economics and other areas than it does in, say, physics and chemistry.
Absolutely. And the other person I'd mention in this area is Charles Goodhart, because I'm guessing some listeners are thinking Goodhart rule in what you just said, because Charles Goodhart, he was talking more about monetary policy, inflation at the time in the 70s, but it was basically pointing to the idea that if you target a variable where there's some strong correlation over a long history of time, if you target a variable that's linked to this correlation, then the correlation itself can change. And that's one of the reasons why these instrumentalist models don't perform very well, is that you can have the sort of Goodhart law effect. But that also relates to, like you say, if you have a model that is being used across the board in the industry and it's suddenly, released onto the industry and everyone starts using it, it can create a repatterning of the system, right? That then actually undermines the model itself.
Yes, exactly.
And that's a really powerful point. So thank you for making it.
Yeah.
So I'll mention a few other points. So I think that complexity science promotes the idea of using multiple heterogeneous models. Okay. I think the mechanistic mindset pushes us more towards, finding one glorious model that kind of, represents the whole system. But actually, complexity science recognizes that actually it's great to have, if possible, it's great to have multiple models that kind of look at the system from different perspectives. And this again relates to the concept of requisite variety I mentioned earlier, that sort of came out of cybernetics. Another thing I'd say that it comes from a good friend of mine, Richard Carter. He used this phrase in a call we had with some people. He's an AI expert, and he had this phrase, "Hold the model lightly," right? And what he means by that is don't base all of your decisions on like one or multiple models, right? Just know that the model is an opinion or a perspective on the subject. It generates some opinion, let's say, generates some numbers that you can help, but hold them lightly. Don't kind of just assume that model is perfect and you should just listen only to the model. Listen to other voices and hold the model lightly. Okay. And I think that's very beautiful and poetic. So I would say that. The next point actually is something you mentioned in conversation when we talked last week, which is really balancing between reality, between a model reflecting reality and being tractable, right? So because it's important that the end users of models understand the limitations of the model, right? Otherwise, they can make bad decisions. So in order for them to understand the model, often these models have to be tractable, have to be understandable to those users. But at the same time, reality might be pulling the model towards being more complicated. So there's a balance to be struck, and I don't think you can come out with you can't come out on one side. It's just pragmatically in the context. It's good to have models that are relatively simple. And there's good research on saying that actually simple models can be very powerful. I think a lot more than we realize. The next point I'd make is something I know some asset management companies do already, and I think it's made its way into some regulations, which is apply governance and risk controls to your models. Okay, so if you are using multiple models in various contexts, keep an eye on which are performing well and which are performing poorly, and when and why, so that you can then build up an understanding of which models are better to deploy in some contexts. So I'd say that that's another important point. I've got two more points to make, which is when you're modeling, and if we're thinking in a sort of machine-like way, often we can miss out some sort of complexity-related patterns. So things like feedback effects and emergence. So getting the ontology right of the model is important, and building in relevant complexity principles, I think, is really important. I think the last point I would make is that yes, so there's a broad theme here as I think as the world is shifting away from the mechanistic mindset and towards something that's more complexity-like or systems-like. There's also a shift, I think, broadly away from mathematical models towards agent-based models or computational models. Okay, I'm making a broad overgeneralization. Mathematics is incredibly powerful, as you know. I'm not devaluing that at all. And this is a point that Rick made a few weeks ago in the podcast with Genevieve. And it links very much to computational irreducibility, right? Often you can't apply closed form mathematical models to complex contexts, right? You're trying to squeeze a round peg into a square hole, right? So often complex contexts require something like agent-based modeling, because you can tailor the model, right, and make it more appropriate for that particular context. And Brian Arthur's talked about this, and to paraphrase something he said, that mathematical models, when you're looking at complex contexts, are often a very good first order approximation. Okay, they can be very powerful, but often if you want to model the context better or more accurately or more realistically, you need to shift into computation. So that's a broad. I would say there's and Brian actually wrote a paper that contained this point, that there seems to be a broad shift from the mathematical perspective to a computational perspective. So that's I'll draw a line there, and draw a line under that, and see if you got any thoughts on any of that.
Well, I was just going to say, in terms of the first point, in terms of, again, some mathematical models can, are sort of first order, approximations. I would say, I think John von Neumann, made even more general statement about models. And again, it's about models are at best an approximation of reality. And I think, that's, again, that's important to remember, that we have all these very, sophisticated and more, advanced models. But again, they are approximations. And again, keeping that in mind when you're using those models is very important. And I would say, in terms of what I'm saying, in terms of the research that I've done, is that we are moving a lot towards the computational side. And I think we've been afforded those tools and that analysis because of the computing power and the data that we have. And so, that's been quite exciting for research. But then also, again, recognizing, the computations and what they can do, and really understanding the basis of those models is important. And, in terms of how you're understanding models, it's like building blocks. You have the ground layer, and then you understand the next layer and the next layer, and it's looking at all those layers together in terms of your model would really give you that sort of that comprehensive view.
Absolutely. I'm glad to hear that we're sort of on the same page, as they say. I will actually, and I want to quickly, you mentioned von Neumann point, and obviously George Box made something a similar.
All models are wrong, but some are useful.
Yeah, exactly. And Often people throw that at me when I talk about kind of, the mechanistic mindset and mistakes we've made with models. But my reaction to that is actually to paraphrase Animal Farm, which is some models are more accurate than others. Okay, so there is, and I know that there's a lot of subjectivity about these things and personal opinions, but I would say that actually there are some models that are just simply more accurate than others, and so just because something is a model doesn't mean it's fully legitimate, right? So that's my reaction, is to kind of basically paraphrase Animal Farm. Some models are more accurate than others.
I haven't heard that since, my early secondary school days studying
Yeah,
that.
so the George Box, right?
Exactly.
The Animal Farm.
Yeah, we're part of a farm, yes.
Yeah.
Oh, that's great. Okay, so I thought maybe we can touch on one last topic, which is on the area of systems level investing. So this is sort of, a newer area for me, and definitely developing my sort of interest and sort of my understanding through my co-authored paper with Genevieve on reframing financial markets. So very interesting. But let me just give sort of a short summary of what this area is, and then get your thoughts on it. So while broad in definition, systems level investing is an approach that treats capital markets as complex interconnected systems and aims to enhance long-term returns by strengthening the resilience of those systems themselves, e.g. financial, environmental, or social. In practice, systems level investing accepts that a large share of long horizon portfolio outcomes comes outside of market-wide drivers, and uses approaches such as capital allocation, stewardship, and policy engagement to reduce system-wide risks that improve the health of the overall market ecology. So in this broad space, what are your views on systems level investing and the role of complexity in this space?
Okay, so I think I need to qualify a lot more here than I've done so far, which is this is not an area I've got a huge amount of expertise in. I do know some things about it, and I've rubbed shoulders with some people in this area. And we can also talk about total portfolio approaches as well, because they sort of tend to be put into the same basket as systems investing. But my understanding of systems investing, and it's been it's exploded in the last sort of 5 years or so. Kind of 15 reports I found online talking about this. My understanding, so I think the lineage. One of the points here is that the lineage of the systems investing is slightly different to complexity science. It's from a more system science, and they are close cousins. But the names that tend to pop up are Jay Forrester, and Donna Meadows. So that's a different kind of angle to slightly different angle to complexity science. So the lineage is important, and path dependence and all that. And like you say, there's a strong focus on planetary systems and sustainability science and long-term stewardship, and the system they're talking about the systems are the wider systems, environmental systems, and so forth. And there's I think a general understanding or emphasis on investors being systems actors, and so I value that immensely, because they are influencing. Investors influence the whole system. There's a lot of overlap with what I've talked about so far. I would say perhaps the main difference I've identified, to the extent I'm familiar with this this terrain, is that they're doing a great job of where I think they believe investors should go to, right, and are sort of almost trying to bring the future forwards. And I value that massively. I think the values, or the normative perspective that they have is incredibly important. I'm trying to, in a sense, what you probably got a sense of, is I'm trying to start with where most asset management people are now, right? How they're dealing with portfolios, whether they're doing ESG or not. Okay, and I'm really interested in supporting them, and where that $130 trillion is being managed. So that's kind of my emphasis. And so in a sense, systems investing has been more radical than what I'm talking about. I just want to be very clear that I fully support what's behind what they're trying to do. We need to make sure the the planet is sustainable. We've made lots of mistakes with the environment, and we've destroyed communities, across the world, and we make lots of mistakes with governance and long-term stewardship. So I fully appreciate what that perspective is trying to do, and I want the financial system to move more aggressively in that direction. But I'm sort of, in a sense, kind of coming at asset managers more so under the radar to support them with what they're currently doing, and to be inclusive of all asset managers. The total portfolio approach, this is really interesting. I hadn't come across it until you mentioned it the other day, to be honest, or rather, I came across it in your report that you wrote with Genevieve.
Yes.
But my understanding is that is essentially a governance move. So that replaces strategic asset allocation approaches. So rather than a sort of board of governors and trustees, setting a bunch of benchmarks and proportions of the portfolio in benchmarks, and then telling the chief investment officer, you've got to invest in this way, they get rid of that and just say our aims are X, Y, and Z. And then chief investment officer and your team, you can now go ahead and try and achieve those aims.
Yes.
Right. So it's kind of replaces the kind of traditional strategic asset allocation. I think that approach is would really enable what I'm talking about, and a kind of complexity informed approach to asset management. It doesn't necessarily lead to it, right? Because you can still do very standard asset management. So it's my understanding is more of a governance approach. But I think both are very compatible. I don't think there's any incompatibility with what I'm talking about. They just have slightly different perspectives and values to what I'm currently trying to work on.
Yes. No, I think it's, good to, again, clarify, it doesn't mean, systems level investing doesn't necessarily mean, you're straight into sort of, complexity thinking. One may do systems level investing, but may do it, I don't know, from maybe a mechanistic mindset or a given way, which maybe is not incorporating complexity. So it's good, as you say, to qualify, maybe the difference.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would flag that there's a slightly awkward argument often between what people who consider themselves complexity scientists and those that see themselves more as system scientists, even though they're very close cousins, and there's no consensus definition on both, so I have to be careful with what I'm saying. But often the complexity science crowd say that system scientists tend to treat systems as broadly stable, right? As if they're kind of fixed, and that all we need to do is then repattern the system to how we want it, and then we can just leave it. Whereas the complexity scientists say, well, okay, that's kind of legitimate, but you have to understand that the system will always repattern itself over time. And you have to account for the unexpected and uncertainty and so forth. And so I'm skating on thin ice, but I think that that's worth noting in terms of the difference between system science and complexity science.
Absolutely. Great. So,
if you want to talk about AI,
I was just going to mention, maybe, because we have some time, again, this is such a, again, very broad topic and very popular right now in terms of the conversation. And I guess I just wanted to open up the question to be really broad about all of the things that we've talked about, whether it's systems level investing, modeling, uncertainty versus risk. I don't know, where does sort of, in your view, AI sit, with all of the topics there? And what does that mean going forward for complexity?
Okay, thank you. So first qualification naturally is that I'm not an expert on artificial intelligence. I have more expertise in complexity science. I mean, there's a lot of overlap between the two, and AI uses a lot of technology and computational approaches that are very compatible with complexity science. I'd make a few points with that qualification aside. And the first is that I think that complexity science is a really helpful overarching framing for understanding intelligence in general, okay, in complex systems, whether that's human or artificial, okay? And I think that I'm going to mention a friend of mine, Richard Carter, again. His expertise in AI. He wrote a really good book called Cognitive Advantage about 5 years ago, and he argued in that book that the current challenge is is not so much how AI can take over from human processes and thinking. It's much more about how do we combine human and artificial intelligence, okay? And I think that's a really powerful point, because neither is better than the other. They both have their strengths. AI can do certain things really well and certain things badly, and human intelligence can do certain things well and certain things badly.
Yeah.
So I think the aim there is really, so the question is really sort of how do we combine those things? But I think complexity sciences are just a really quite nice sort of conceptual wrapper to help us understand, because AI can be understood as, you know, a cognitive agent, right? So it sits really well in my definition of complex systems. So that's one point I'd make. Second point I'd make is about I'm really keen for any artificial entity to have lines of accountability to human beings, because my worry is that we're in situations when an AI entity makes the decision and then nobody's accountable for it. Okay, that's one of my concerns. And I mean, the most extreme example of that obviously is in warfare. You know, so if there's some drone somewhere that decides to launch a missile based on some AI entity and it kills some civilians, who's accountable for that? Right? We might even need to rethink the Geneva Convention based on that, to add, you know, if any AI entity kills civilians, then whoever, you know, introduced that AI is responsible for it. Okay, so that's, I mean, obviously that's a very extreme example, but I think in general we have to have lines of accountability. But actually, we discussed this a little bit earlier. The third thing I would mention is linking it to uncertainty, right? So as I said, that AI has unearthed some knowledge in a sense, like with antibiotics. So it's very helpful to mitigate the knowledge problem we have in some domains. And also we can think of it in terms of limited human cognition, is that it's a cognitive annex, okay, to us, and that it can help us think about things. And yeah, I often brainstorm with ChatGPT, you know, and you have to be, okay, yeah, I mean, you have to be really careful using it. And you've probably learnt this thing that, you know, if you're going to take any action with anything you've got from ChatGPT, you verify it, right? Outside of ChatGPT. And as long as again, that's one of the weaknesses of AI. As long as you verify it, then I think it's very powerful. So the fourth point I'd make is, actually this is a kind of, this is a worry of mine. I wouldn't attach a large probability to this, and it relates to what we mentioned earlier, what we talked about with model collapse. I'd imagine that there are quite a range of quantitative asset managers out there that are using AI right now. Okay, I'm sure they've been doing this for years. I'm not familiar with this field, but you know, it would be unimaginable that they're not. My worry is that if that trading becomes quite a large proportion of market activity, it can introduce unstable dynamics to markets. And my worry is kind of the equivalent of model collapse, is where AIs are making decisions that lead to extreme volatility. And so we mentioned the podcast from a couple of weeks ago, Genevieve and
Bookstaber.
Yeah, the podcast from a couple of weeks ago, or 2 or 3 weeks ago, from which involved Rick. He mentioned the 1987 stock market crash, and we know what happened there. There were circuit breakers in the system that led people to sell as market prices were declining, and obviously that was a feedback effect. You can imagine something very, very similar or equivalent happening with AI, where AI models bounce off each other, and you get extreme volatility. And the broad domain actually this links to is endogenous volatility. So in complexity science, there is a small literature on endogenous volatility, and that's talking about how systems can actually generate their own volatility. And so it's a bit of a dystopian picture I'm painting. I'm generally optimistic about AI as contribution to humanity. But there are, you know, that is one of my worries, that, you know, the next crash could actually be generated by AIs talking to each other and creating, you know, these detrimental feedback effects. So yeah, I'll draw a line under it there. Like I say, I'm not an expert on AI, but those are the sorts of things that I would say.
Yeah, no, I think exactly. I think when hearing sort of the conversations, I mean, everyone recognizes the capabilities and what AI can do. And, I think there's definitely an embrace to sort of its use. I think where, a lot of the worries or potential, oversight may need to be thought of is on the, the risk side. As you say, what happens if there are trades or positions, say, that AI is making, and then there's sort of extremely, highly volatile, there's large losses, and who does that affect? Does that affect, the retail investor? Does that affect someone's pension? That can be real economic and social consequences there.
Absolutely.
So really putting those rail guards and those, those circuit breakers to protect those, within the financial industry that may be exposed to those types of risks is quite important.
And I would emphasize that it's very tempting to say, well, if this is a potentially systemic problem, it's a problem for the regulators. I would say actually this is systemic problems are in a sense all our responsibility, right? So if you're if you're a quant and you're applying this stuff, I think you do have some responsibility for how your AI is interacting with other AIs, interacting with other AIs. So I mean, some people might very much disagree with that, but actually I think that that we all have to take responsibility for the whole system.
Exactly. And I think that also just circles back to our whole discussion in terms of uncertainty versus risk and modeling and the things that you can do in order to account for that complexity, and that that starts with your processes and the way you make decisions.
Absolutely.
Bang on. Fantastic. So as maybe go into some closing remarks. So we've really touched on quite a range of topics in complexity, and how hopefully how such methods and approaches are relevant for practitioners. As we close, Greg, what are your key takeaways for which complexity and systems-based thinking is relevant for the asset management industry?
Okay, I think I'd make 5 quick points that I think I've covered all these already. One is that complexity science is an enormous shift in how we understand systems, and I think the world is going to shift away from the mechanistic mindset towards the complexity mindset, and it already has to some extent. And there's a lot of material out there on this. I'm not just making this up myself. There's huge amounts of work that's gone in complexity science. If your readers want to read a summary paper I've written, then there's one on my website, which is an introduction to complexity science for asset managers. That's gregfisher.net. If you just have a poke around, you'll find that. If your listeners want to read a fantastic book on this area, it's not on finance, but it's The Tao of Complexity by Gene Bolton, and it really unpacks in a superb way many of the things I've talked about. Tao is spelled D-A-O, so the Tao of Complexity. And some of your listeners might be familiar with the Tao of Physics. And so that book, I think, is the broad equivalent to the Tao of Physics, so the Tao of Complexity. So the second point I'd make is just to emphasize, I'm obviously not alone in doing all this stuff. There's other, people that are working, some brilliant people working in this area. So this is an important area that I think is becoming deeper and deeper, and more people are going to use it. But I'd say that the third point I'd make to link to that is that I think actually the asset management industry, and I don't mean to offend anyone, is actually behind the curve here. Complexity science has been applied a lot in economics, in management science, in some political science, in some public policy, and so it's been applied in a number of domains increasingly. And I think the asset management industry is, even though there are 2 or 3 asset management companies or more, there are probably more, generally speaking, the asset management industry is behind the curve. So that makes my fourth point is to link that to my complexity arbitrage paper. And I realize saying this, I've sounded like a terrible salesman, but I really, I'm saying this to really kind of encourage the industry to manage assets better, for the betterment of humanity, really. So my complexity arbitrage paper really sort of actually summarizes 7 papers I've written on various subjects, and we've discussed just 2 of them, which is on models and uncertainty versus risk. Yeah. There's other things I've talked about, like non-ergodicity, which I've mentioned a couple of times. Thinking about, so one of my papers is about asset prices as emergent properties. Another paper looks at the role of narratives in financial markets. So there's a bunch of other things that we can talk about, but the complexity arbitrage paper sort of summarizes some of the things I've written, most of which are unpublished. And the fifth point I'd make, which is actually I'm going to repeat what I said earlier, which is this point about practicalities. I'm super keen for this work to be, to land with asset managers and to be practically relevant on the ground. And as I said before, I think there are two waves. We're in the first wave, which is to apply complexity thinking in a broad sense to asset management, and that's what I've done for the last 2 years. But the second wave has to get going, and we have to focus on the questions I asked earlier, which is what are the complexity equivalent of modern portfolio theory, arbitrage pricing theory, the efficient markets hypothesis? How should asset managers manage their portfolios from a complexity science point of view? There's a lot of work that needs to be done to stitch those things together. And I think the practical implications come from that as a kind of second wave of advice.
Great. Awesome. So exactly, and you mentioned exactly the complexity arbitrage paper and maybe some other papers that you're working on. Are there any other sort of plans and sort of the research that you're doing as Entana that our listeners should be aware of?
Yeah. So I finished my PhD thesis a couple of years ago, and I've decided to. I've set myself a bit of a mission for the next 10 to 15 years, which is to really try and facilitate the greater use of complexity science and asset management. Like I say, there are some companies already doing it. And I think that project broadly has three themes. One is to both work on and catalyze the research in academia. I want to be integrated into asset managers to ensure that there's practical development of implications, right? So that we're focused on what does this really mean, the so what question. And the third point is really to ensure the two communities are talking to each other, right? Because a lot of finance is incredibly clever, and this is not the case with all of it, but a lot of finance is incredibly clever, but it's quite some distance away from reality. And I hope that doesn't offend too many people, but there's also great work that is more connected. And I want to make sure that this work is the two are connected. So theory work works with pragmatic implications well. So I want to do that bridging over the next few years, like I say, 10 to 15. Part of that is, so my role at Santana, for the next year, there's a specific empirical piece of work I want to do, which is to interview, say, 20 to 25 asset managers to make sense of their context through a complexity lens. And I should say that I've worked in a pension fund and I've worked in a macro hedge fund, and I'm a CFA charter holder. So I have some sense of how the industry works, but I want to get into deeper conversations about their context. Right? I want to know, investment managers, what does your world look like from a complexity science point of view? With a view, one of the aims of that is actually to say to the academic community, produce a paper that says to the academic community, look, this is the world of asset management in reality, and these are the needs it has, right? And please service those needs. Okay. So that's broadly what I want to do over the next year or so. And I'll put a sort of pitch out to your listeners, which is if you're interested in being a guinea pig, then please connect with me. I'll give you my email address if that's okay with you.
Yeah.
Which is I won't use the Santana email address because it's just too long and complicated and easy to get wrong. But my work email address is greg@gregfisher.net. Okay, which is much easier to note and use and not make a mistake. So, but on top of those interviews, if any of our listeners, if this resonates, what I've said resonates with your listeners, then I'm open to dialogue. I'm open to sort of just, talking. If there's any feedback on what I've said, if anybody's actually doing things out in the markets that I'm not aware of, I'm really interested to know. I don't know everything, I'm highly uncertain about certain parts of the market, obviously. So if anybody is listening, is interested, then please get in touch. I'm all ears, and I'm open to a dialogue with people who are interested.
Exciting stuff. Yeah, a lot there. So really interesting. And so all I'll say is, Greg, thank you very much for coming and and joining me on the show. So thank you very much.
It's been wonderful to be here, and thank you for having me.
Yeah, and I am Raymond Pang, and this has been The Enterprising Investor. Thank you.